So hello, everybody. We're running this session for the speakers in Zoom, but everybody else is on YouTube, so we can't actually get a feel here for how many of you there are, but welcome anyway to the first in the CCP Conversations series. We hope that it will be a series. We've got a very, very good topic for the first of the series because it is one that there's a lot of conversation going on about and that indeed needs to go on about. It's a case, a judgment that has sent shockwaves through competition world and is really very controversial. So we hope that we will bring out in this 1 hour session some of the key points of controversy. And we have two excellent speakers to help us through that, both of whom are key CCP members. We have Elias, who is works on law, and so he's going to be bringing a legal perspective. We have Kai-Uwe Kühn, who is Professor of Economics and is going to be bringing an economic perspective. He also was the chief economist at DG Comp, not for this case, but for the Austrian mobile mergers that kind of set the methodology that this case was a follow-up on. So in a way, this is a judgment on his work. And so he has a little bit of an axe to grind, but that doesn't mean that his views should be in any way discounted, because there's, this is very difficult but important stuff. So there is a lot to pack into 1 hour. So we're not actually going to try and have Q&A. There is a message, a chat bit in YouTube. So please feel free to chat amongst yourselves. It's not as rude as at a normal conference because you won't interrupt us. So you can feel free to do as much of that as you want. But we will just proceed without Q&A. And I will ask Elias to introduce the case.
Yes, so I hope now the presentation works. Yes. So thank you, Amelia, for introducing both of us. And we thought in order to start this conversation, it's really important to set out clearly what this case is about. So the CK Telecoms case is about a merger between Three and O2 in the UK mobile telecoms market. And this merger would have reduced the players in this market from 4 to 3. And in 2016, the European Commission decided to block the merger. And this decision has been appealed to the General Court of the European Union. And in this case, the General Court had the opportunity to review for the first time in the history of the SIEC test, the application of this new substantive test introduced by the Merger Regulation 2004 with respect to the analysis of unilateral effects in so-called gap cases, so cases where the merger does not create a dominant position, but nonetheless raises competitive or anti-competitive issues because of the unilateral effects that it gives rise to. And this is fascinating because for the last 16 years, the European Commission actually applied its unilateral effects analysis in line with the horizontal merger guidelines, but the EU courts never had the opportunity to actually express themselves on the legality of this assessment. And what's puzzling about this case is really that the General Court decided to annul the Commission decision on almost all substantive grounds. And from this perspective, the General Court seems to raise here the bar for the European Commission to challenge any future horizontal merger on the basis of unilateral effects. And we also think that this judgment really raises important questions about the appropriate role of economic evidence in horizontal merger cases and also the requisite standard for this economic evidence. And we also might argue that it has a number of unintended consequences for the economic analysis in future merger cases. And just to give you an overview on the facts of this case, so we are talking here about the UK mobile telecommunication services market, where you have 4 major players, 4 so-called MNOs, so mobile network operators, who own their own mobile telecommunications network. And in addition, you have a competitive fringe of quite a number of non-MNOs who provide telecom services to consumers by roaming on one of those 4 MNOs networks. And the merger announced in 2016 would have combined the second player in the market, so O2, with the 4th player in the market, Free. And the market shares would have been approximately between 40 and 50%. And the European Commission, in order to block this merger, based in its decision on 3 theories of harm. So it found, first of all, unilateral effects on the retail market for telecom services, where the MNOs provide mobile telecom services to consumers. It also raised concerns about the impact of the merger on the existing network sharing agreements in the UK telecom market. And it also identified adverse effects on the wholesale market for telecommunication services. However, in our discussion, we will mostly focus on this first theory of harm, the unilateral effects on the retail market for telecommunication services. And here the European Commission argued that the merger between Free and O2 would lead to price increases for consumers. And it based this finding, first of all, on the fact that Free and O2 are close competitors. So prior to the merger, due to the closeness of competition between O2 and Free, the Commission argued that at least in response to a price increase, some consumers would have diverted their sales to Free. And as a consequence of the merged entity could internalize those losses. And by removing the competitive constraints that the 2 merging parties have exerted on each other prior to the merger, the merger will give an incentive for the merged entity to raise its prices. Moreover, the Commission also argued that Free is actually a very aggressive player in this mobile telecommunications market, and argued that it is an important competitive force, and the merger, by removing this important competitive force, would also reduce the competitive pressure in the mobile telecommunications market. And what is interesting here, and perhaps also puzzling, is that the Commission also found that the diversion ratios, so the closeness of competition between non-merging parties with O2, was actually somewhat closer than the competitive relationship between Free and O2. Nonetheless, the Commission concluded that the merger will give rise to unilateral effects due to price increases, on the one hand, on the part of the merged entity, but also on the part of the non-merging parties. And the Commission also supported this finding with quantitative evidence, so merger simulations based on the UPP, so upward pricing pressure methodology, where it identified indicative segment-wide price increases between 5.7 to 7.3%. And I hand on now to Kai-Uwe, who will give us a bit of an overview on the economic evidence that the Commission used in this case.
Yeah, and before I kind of go into the different pieces of the evidence, I think there's one thing, if you read the decision and you read the economic evidence, is that there's a certain disconnect between how the legal text actually writes about closeness of competition and other issues, and how the economic evidence is actually being used. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that these documents of decisions are actually not necessarily completely coherent documents. They're being written by different people. And the legal argument is often very much written also by the legal service, and it doesn't really take into account fully how the economic argument works. So I think what we're going to see here is also a divergence in the way that economic evidence actually works. And this is kind of one of the unfortunate cases in which the chief economist team has not been able to get the analysis into the main text of the decision, but mostly just into an appendix. And that's typically also where then the risks come up, because it's misinterpreted what the evidence actually says. And I think that will also in the later discussion kind of show us why sometimes concept of two firms are close is just somewhat of distorts a little bit the picture of what exactly the economics says. So what I think is important here, and what we're not going to discuss very much, but as a first screening type of issue, is that market share information was used here. And it's a long debate that goes back to the merger that I did on this, which Amelia mentioned, which was one of those mergers where no one wanted to touch it because the market shares of the two parties, also involving Hutchison here, were in the 20% range. And I intervened and basically said, this is nuts, because the existing contracts aren't what you're competing for. You're competing for new contracts, so market share should really be the new contracts. And what you're seeing kind of in the legal sphere, they want to go back to the market shares that are actually there and then basically say we have this additional analysis on the expansions. But it's really the shares in new contracts that matter, and the development of market shares over time. And what happened in the Austrian case and also here is that you had a relatively small market share for Hutchison, but if you're looking at the share of new subscriptions, they actually went up very strongly. And in the Austrian case, it was above 30% that they were getting. So relative to the existing contracts, they were someone who was really growing in the market, and that made a difference. The second analysis that was there is the diversion ratio analysis. And I think that's the analysis where we're getting closest to the closeness of competition concept. And we're going to talk about that later. And they used here a survey to assess switching in response to a price increase. And I'm going to tell you why that's actually an improvement on some of the work that was done earlier in these types of cases. Then there's a price effects analysis, which is a UPP-Guppy analysis. And then also a merger simulation based on UPP. I think the second step is actually very uninformative once you have the first step. But the price effects analysis here is really important because it is a price effects analysis, but it's being discounted by the court. And I think that's going to be an important topic to discuss on how economic evidence about price effects can actually be brought to bear. Because supposedly you should be going further here, and we'll discuss that. And the fourth one, and that was also very dear to my heart, what I've always argued when I was in the agency is that you should be able to go back and say, what do we know generally about ex-post merger studies in the industry about the order of magnitude of these effects? Because we're never going to have perfect evidence. And so if we have ex-post merger studies, that should be shifting our presumptions about something where we don't have perfect evidence. And so this was used here. It was very much discounted in its weight, also because there was a lot of discussion about ex-post merger studies and controversy about ex-post merger studies that the parties were actually submitting. But here you essentially get one of those cases where the typical range of economic evidence is being used. Something that's based on market share, something that's based on direct evidence on substitution, something that's based on actually a price effects analysis, and on top of that, kind of general experience about price effects in that area. So if we're looking at this is kind of almost the scheme by which you would be trying to do these cases, especially a 4-3, where you kind of worry that if you don't look for the price effects, you might be getting it wrong. Okay, so that's the framework. That would be kind of the economic view on this. It kind of ticks all the boxes. Now let's see how the court actually dealt with these.
And I think this is particularly interesting for, I don't know how many people on are from Europe versus from the UK and the rest of the world, but actually these sorts of economic evidence is what has been being used in the UK, I think, for longer, actually, even than the Commission has been using it. This is really quite an economic evidence heavy approach. But in the UK, the case teams are very much made up of the legal expertise and the economics expertise working absolutely hand in hand. So there isn't that division that you get in Brussels. So it'd be interesting when we're going through this to think about whether you might hit the same issues in the UK or not. But we've got 4 main discussion points that we're going to try and fit into this hour. And the first one, Elias, if you could kick off, it's on the standard of proof for finding an SIEC.
Yeah, so the first major point of contention in this judgment is maybe the paragraph 118. So in this paragraph, the General Court argued that if the Commission in a merger case relies on several theories of harm, then it has to show anti-competitive effects, not with a standard of proof, which is the usual balance of probability standard. So it doesn't only have to show that the anti-competitive effects are more likely than not, but the standard should be stricter. However, at the same time, the General Court also said this standard shouldn't be as strict as the beyond all reasonable doubt standard. And this is really, from a legal perspective, quite a bombshell paragraph, because it raises a lot of questions. Because in particular, from a legal perspective, this question of the standard of proof in EU merger regulation or in EU merger control has not always been very clear. And what one might criticize from a legal perspective is that the judgment here doesn't further develop whether this standard is supposed to apply to all mergers, so be it horizontal, vertical, or conglomerate, whether it's just limited to horizontal mergers, or whether it's just limited to horizontal mergers where the Commission relies on several theories of harm. So this is the first legal point that one might ask. The second one is, so what's actually the case law that supports this strict standard? And if you look at the paragraph here, you don't see any legal case, but you just see 2 opinions of the Advocate General, Tiziano and Jeskinen, that the court quotes in support of this strict standard of proof. And the court seems to disagree with the opinion of Advocate General Cocotte, who argued in Bertelsmann that the standard of proof should be one of balance of probabilities. So here the question is, so on which basis does the General Court actually opt for this very demanding standard of proof for this type of horizontal mergers? And then what we also wonder is, to what extent is a probabilistic formulation of the standard of proof in merger analysis actually useful? So if we, as lawyers, speak about the balance of probabilities, economists normally suggest that this is equivalent to a critical likelihood ratio of 51%. So for instance, in the context of merger control, with a balance of probabilities, you would have to show that a merger will, with a probability of 51%, lead to anti-competitive effects. Beyond reasonable doubt, the criminal standard is normally associated with a critical likelihood ratio of 90%. So if we take this probabilistic understanding of the court's formulation of the standard of proof, then we end up with a potential range of probabilities which are between 52, so slightly stricter than a balance of probabilities, and 89, so slightly less strict than the beyond reasonable doubt standard. And one might argue, ask oneself now, so where does the General Court actually draw the line here? And what is important to underline is that the critical changes in the critical likelihood ratio might actually have quite wide-ranging implications. So if you say that, for instance, the General Court had in mind a probability ratio of 66%, this would require the European Commission to show that the merger is twice more likely to lead to anti-competitive effects than not. So this might be actually an unexpected consequence of this strict standard of proof. Moreover, it would also, to some extent, create a presumption in favor of those horizontal mergers, at least an implied presumption, which raises issues with existing case law. And one might also ask, so how does this very strict standard square with decision theory, because decision theory normally suggests that the optimal standard of proof should be calibrated both with the likelihood and the magnitude of the expected anti-competitive harm. And one would normally expect a 4-to-3 merger to have quite a high likelihood of and quite a high magnitude of anti-competitive harm. So this might also be one of the critical points here. I think Kai-Uwe would also like to add perhaps some.
Yeah, I'd love to say a couple of things about this, because I think this is. So there are lots of economic models around where you kind of think about the likelihood of something happening and the damage or benefit and so on and so forth. And they make sense as economic models. Here the question is, do these things make sense of standards that you can kind of achieve? And the traditional judicial standards actually make some sense, because if you're saying balance of likelihood, you're actually not calculating probabilities, and you're not asking anybody to calculate probabilities, but you're asking someone to say, well, if you would bet on this outcome, right? And we bet about you paying for my drink or I paying for the drink, right? What are you going to bet on? That the merger, that this is pro-competitive or anti-competitive. That is something that I can answer, even if I don't have a clear probabilistic model in my head about what I would think given the evidence, right? So if someone afterwards does an ex post analysis, where are they going to come out? Okay, and I'd be willing to make that bet as a small bet. Beyond reasonable doubt is also pretty clear. It basically says, look, with everything that I've seen otherwise, there's no way that I would be worried about being wrong here, right? Of course, it can always sometimes happen, but that's that qualitative difference between standards, in that you can still objectify between different people who are not going to share the same probabilistic assessments, even if you think we have those in our heads. Now we're going somewhere in between. And the question really is that there's no mapping from the evidence to a 66% standards. There's absolutely nothing here. And so what it actually does, and it's really funny that this comes from lawyers, it actually increases the legal uncertainty about whether a merger of this type is going to go through or not, because it's going to depend on the agency, who's going to say, yeah, that's above 66%. And on the judges afterwards, who are going to say, nah, it's more 59, right? And so that is precisely what we actually don't want. And so to turn something on something that then becomes rather esoteric as a discussion is incredibly unhelpful, because it's getting us away from the question, how do we actually structure evidence to get there? Now, I think from the economic point of view, there's a certain degree of experience that we've gotten, which basically says, look, in a 2-to-1 merger, we should expect that the prices go up. And when I was facing people who said, well, this is a 3-to-2 merger, who says that 3-to-2 mergers are bad? I would have said, well, the only thing that's worse is a 2-to-1. So in a 3-to-2, I want to have some qualitative evidence that that's probably going to go in this direction. I can see cases in which even the 3-to-2 might not be problematic. And we've essentially cleared things like that, but you then go further. But if I have no other information, I'm actually happy to, with relatively little information about substitutability, say, this is probably bad, and I'm willing to intervene. With a 4-to-3, and also we know kind of 2-to-1s, 3-to-2s, kind of the order of magnitude of these price effects in studies are always above the 5-10% thresholds that we worry about. So on average, we're going to be right with that presumption. Now, what you get with 4-to-3s is that picture is much more mixed. You're getting it in situations where there's product differentiation and so on and so forth. So actually, in that context, our benchmark was always, we want more. We want actually some evidence that pushes in the direction that we can say, yeah, we have here evidence that there's a price effect. And we have different tools for that. We can do entry analysis or impact analysis when someone dropped out of the market, or we have the UPP tests. All of those are kind of things that tell us something about the likely order of magnitude of price effects. And we want to have that additional evidence in a case like that can go in different directions, because we don't have strong presumptions from the qualitative measures in the market. Now, that gives you kind of an economics-based hierarchy of evidence that actually you can map into the traditional standards, and probably the standard of balance of probabilities makes the most sense in that kind of context. But it actually gives you something really operational that you can also check, because there is a hierarchy of evidence from the weaker to the stronger. And there's a second check, which is the consistency of the different evidence that you're putting together. And it's really sad that in terms of the standards of proof, the court's actually taking a step away from a massive amount of evidence that's there, how we can rank and combine evidence for strong outcomes. And that's, I think, particularly concerning about this rather academic debate about the standard of proof on probabilities, rather than really on the practical question of when am I more sure and when I'm less sure.
Thanks. I mean, I would support all of that as well. And I think, a couple of things. It's not, you were describing, Kai-Uwe, that you want different evidence if you have a different initial presumption. And so you have a very strong initial presumption with 2-1. You have a less strong presumption with 4-3, so you need more empirical evidence. Exactly. I'm not clear that the court understands that at all, or indeed the whole thing that economic evidence is always kind of inherently uncertain. So as you're right, you can form a view on balance whether it's telling you one thing or another thing, but trying to get to these percentages is extraordinarily hard, and trying to get to very high percentages is even harder. So I don't think I agree with you necessarily that it increases legal uncertainty. I worry that it creates legal certainty that far too many mergers will get through. For if you look at the mergers regime in an overarching point of view, what's the point of the mergers regime? Is to stop anti-competitive mergers. My worry is that this won't actually achieve the aims of the merger regime.
So I'm not so to respond to that, I'm not sure that goes in that direction, because it creates a lot of discretion both for the agencies and the courts. Because essentially in the end the court says, oh, with this evidence, does it pass the threshold or not? And it's then going to depend on the subjective judgment. And so, but I think what really happens with these things, and that's a lot in these mergers where you're trying to kind of get these strict standards or get a dominant standards or something like this, you end up actually making more type 1 and type 2 mistakes. That is, you're not willing anymore to go for the things that look like they're not problematic because they have small market share, right? But you're also kind of then just focusing on things where you think you have strong presumptions and push them through without actually asking the question, isn't this a special case? And I think that's the really dangerous thing with mergers getting them wrong. We always think about a tougher regime or a less tough regime. I think it's a more error-prone regime if we're not dealing with evidence in the right way.
Okay, that's a good rejoinder. Okay, we should get on to the next discussion point, which is the evidence that was brought on closeness of competition, and also this idea of the important competitive force, which is this idea of the maverick. So, Kai-Uwe, do you want to introduce this?
Yes, and I'm not going to follow Elias's slides on this, although I'm sure he has a lot of good things to say as well. But I think I would like to approach this kind of from the economic side, because I think the closeness idea corresponds to economic concepts that we've had and that then have been translated into the legal area. And as it very often happens with legal terms, the way it's being used has been expanded which is actually reducing the usefulness of the concept without actually going back and asking how does the concept actually map into the evidence. I think what closeness is trying to capture is exactly this intermediate step of evidence that we typically look for as economists. I'm asking the question, what is evidence on substitution here? Okay. And so we want to see whether certain products are close substitutes or less close substitutes. And we actually, over time, developed a lot of empirical abilities for that, just looking at switching behaviors, then talking about divergence and diversion ratios. And what that type of evidence tells us is, movements between firms that might come from price effects. And there are problems with some of that evidence because sometimes the movements might not come from price effects. So you're mixing different things that have imperfect evidence. People have tried to improve on that with actually some demand estimation or with surveys, as in this case. But it's a very substitution targeted inquiry in which you're basically asking, if a price goes up, what would you do? And we do that analysis routinely in these things. Now, what's happened in the attempt to safeguard your decisions on the legal side is to basically say, oh, it's the closest. Oh no, closest isn't always important, but it's a close one. And at the moment, we only say close, and in certain environment, everybody is close. What does that actually still mean? Well, actually, the reason why we're interested in closeness is because of product differentiation, namely that not all firms are symmetric. So that essentially what you could do with complete symmetry is just basically count the number of firms, and you're getting most of the information that you want. With price discrimination, with differentiated products, that's different. And so you kind of want to know, is that merger kind of worse between those two parties than between some other parties? And that's where you want to know what kind of the substitution relationships are. What's even worse, though, and in the way kind of the closeness of competition is being used, and also being used in the decision, in contrast to some of the evidence that they have on the economic side, is that you're seeing very asymmetric substitution patterns. Okay, so between Hutchison and O2, they're going in one direction, which you would get in situations where the product differentiation is somewhat vertical, right? So you have the low cost provider, you kind of have someone in the medium, you have someone in the high cost providers. So most of the substitution goes in one direction, but then the competitive constraint from the one who's the lowest cost provider is particularly important. And if you take this guy, if you're merging with the one where most of the substitution goes to when you're raising your price as the low cost one, you have an incredible effect. Although you might say O2 doesn't have that much of a constraint on Hutchison, or yes, O2 might have a constraint on Hutchison, but not the other way around, right? But that's still a problem for the merger because it pushes the price level in the whole market up. Okay? Now, if you're talking about closeness as a relationship between the parties that's symmetric, you're losing the whole point about the substitution analysis that you actually want to make. And one of the things that I worry about is, one is kind of the preciseness of the analysis, but the other one is also it's one of those terms that has been emptied of content, which you're using when you don't have good evidence. So I think in this case, it kind of goes really very much in both directions, and is part of a trend to go in the direction of trying to changing the standard of proof through the agencies to effectively reverse the burden of proof, which is something I've been concerned about from practice that I've seen over time. So Amelia, it's again one of those things where I think it's going in both directions. We're making more mistakes in both directions with that type of approach, and so that's very worrying. And therefore, I was actually glad that this was ripe to be taken up by a court to ask the question, what are you actually doing here? The question is, has the court done it in the right way? Basically not, because they haven't gone back to the substitution concept. And that's very similar for the particular close or aggressive competitor. And I hate the terminology, for example, of maverick, because it implies something irrational. What we really want to look at, are there some firms that are very different from others in the sense that they have much lower costs, much better access to finance, and Hutchison was in several jurisdictions, especially also in Austria, really the player with great ambitions to get large market shares and get there fast through enormous, and therefore what they did, for example, in Austria, set very low prices on data, with a real pioneer on kind of that high data segment. And we're developing that and becoming a large competitor precisely because of this. And so there it made sense to say there are a particularly aggressive force, and we had the previous merger that wasn't disallowed because of the role as Hutchison as an outsider, and the ex post analysis actually showed that that was indeed the case. So there is meaning in this, but not if you're making it abstract and saying this is an aggressive competitor or something. You want to say, where's the difference? Where's the difference in incentives that they have, which makes them something that is a more aggressive competitor? But not just that, you also want to say, how does that change? And in Austria, the point was, now they were buying a guy with a lot of market share. So this whole driver to get enough share to be actually up there and be able to compete with everybody was gone after the merger. So you would have expected that the incentives would actually change, because the goal of getting to a large market share wasn't there anymore. And so that is really at the essence. And the labeling is really undermining the instrument of analysis that you have from the horizontal merger guidelines. So again, something where the broadening of the concept actually takes us away from actually having valid instrument, and you're just kind of labeling firms in a way that's actually not very close to an analytical approach.
Elias, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think just to come back to what Kai-Uwe mentioned, that there was in the academic literature, and I think amongst commentators, a similar concern that the Commission sometimes, when it uses these concepts in a legalistic way, tries to reverse to some extent the burden of proof. And I think that was a major reason for the General Court to actually argue or create a stricter standard with respect to when closeness is actually indicating unilateral effects, or when a certain firm is to be considered an important competitive force. But I also, so you see this move where the Commission says, okay, the firms do only have to be close or only have to be aggressive, towards the General Court saying, okay, they have to be particularly close or particularly aggressive. However, I also have, from a legal perspective, a lot of questions of how this, to some extent, formalistic approach towards those economic concepts then are to be translated into legal analysis, and which type of economic evidence should support the finding of a particularly close relationship, for instance. And another question is, of course, does the General Court here overrule the horizontal merger guidelines, where the Commission only referred to a close competitors as or closeness of competition as an indication for a potential unilateral effect? I think this are the points that might, from a legal perspective, raise some major question marks.
Yeah, so my feeling is I agree with Kai-Uwe that it's really important to be precise about what you mean and not just reach the concepts. But I do worry that in creating the particularly close concept, we've just got another concept, but it's actually a concept that is not useful, or at least that it will, as you say, Kai-Uwe, create new errors, potentially both ways. So this is another difficult aspect. Of course, if one could rely on the empirical assessment and of pricing post-merger, then you wouldn't need to worry so much about whether things were close or not close, but that's what we'll come on to next. I think, Elias, you're going to introduce this.
Yeah, so the use of quantitative evidence, and in particular the UPP analysis here, was of major concern. And the merging parties argued in front of the European Commission back then that the Commission, when it carried out the quantitative UPP analysis, that it should take into account some of the claimed efficiencies that the merger was supposed to create. And the Commission made a couple of observations with respect to the role of this quantitative evidence here, but I'm just focusing now on the arguments about efficiency. And the Commission said, we do not have to factor in what can be called an efficiency credit when we carry out this UPP analysis in phase 2, because we rely actually on much more precise data than we would do when we carry out a UPP test as a screen in phase 1. And if you look at the literature, so for instance, Farrell and Shapiro, they argue for the use of an efficiency credit when the UPP methodology is used as a screen. Moreover, the Commission also argued here that the merging parties would have to substantiate actually the efficiencies in accordance with the merger guidelines in order for those efficiencies to be factored in to the UPP analysis. The General Court took the opposite view. First of all, it raised the observation that UPP analysis will always indicate some price increases in horizontal mergers. I think that's a recurrent argument made by some critics of the UPP analysis. And therefore, the General Court argued, okay, you do not only have to show that the merger will lead to some price increases, but that these increases have to be significant. And then the General Court made a couple of very broad statements, which said that in any case, in horizontal mergers in oligopolistic markets will always lead to some price increases, but they might be defeated in a medium term. But similarly, any concentration will lead to some efficiencies stemming from rationalization and integration of the assets of the merging parties. And what the General Court here criticized is that the Commission did not take into account these standard, what it calls standard efficiencies, when it carried out the UPP analysis. And this is quite surprising because the General Court seems to create a new category of efficiencies, so efficiencies which are specific to each and every merger, which do not have to be substantiated by the merging parties. And those have to be factored into the quantitative analysis of the price effects, whereas other efficiencies which are merger specific, here the burden of proof still lies with the merging parties. And this, of course, raises a number of questions in terms of how you allocate the burden of proof for showing efficiencies, and also how you sequence the analysis of potential efficiencies when you carry out your merger analysis. And one big question is, of course, what is the type of general efficiencies that has to be always incorporated in this UPP analysis? And is there any kind of evidentiary requirement for these efficiencies?
All right. Maybe I should say a couple of things about this, because I think this is from my point of view, in terms of economic analysis, this is almost the worst part of the decision. And let me start, before I go to the efficiencies, let me start with the whole notion that they say UPP is just a screen, and it's not enough to show something in such a 4-3 merger. I think this is unfortunately has been introduced by economists into this debate. Interestingly enough, by economists who have mostly worked as theorists on these things and have little, I think I would claim, understanding of the difficulties of putting evidence together. UPP is actually very evidence intense if you want to do it. And it's not something that you can kind of do as a quick screen of saying, oh, we have some market share data here, let's look at that. It's just simply not the case. It's also really economically not the case, because by now we kind of have studies that if you're doing UPP, actually, first of all, theoretically, if you're doing UPP and can measure price pass-through, you're actually getting a first-order approximation to the price effect of the transaction, and that is actually more robust than a merger simulation, because it depends only on the first-order conditions and not on particular assumptions on the demand. It's just basically saying what's the first-order effect, similar to having linear demand in what people then do in the UPP analysis. But it's been shown that that's actually more robust than using specific analyses with merger simulation. So I mean, sometimes UPP isn't the greatest thing. Sometimes we have much better evidence because we can have impact analysis, entry analysis, and so on which I would put even higher weight because it's more reliable in that way. But it's really the best instrument we had. And when we kind of did the Austrian merger and basically said we need a little bit closer, more about substitution, there wasn't very much that you could really argue about closeness because there wasn't the proper evidence. That was the thing that you could do, and really absolutely nothing else. Now, I think the terrible thing is if one would think that you would take this instrument as a sufficient instrument for price effects out of the hands of an antitrust authority. That doesn't mean that I think UPP is always a great instrument. There's certain data that one uses about diversions that can be incredibly distorting because, for example, if you have trends in demand and so on and so forth, you can get complete nonsense out of that analysis. But that's a question of testing the analysis. It's not a question of if it's done right with the right data, that is the best evidence we can often have in a lot of cases that would be happy about as sufficient evidence for a 3 to 4. And actually often, I mean, in the Austrian case, we had background information that we couldn't use anymore of someone having estimated demand in that context, which was essentially verifying what we were assuming about diversions. So I think here's a real danger of a powerful, important instrument that nevertheless has to be wisely used to be taken out of the hands of the agencies. And I think that would be a terrible thing, and that would indeed go in the direction of not having enough evidence in 4 to 3s anymore to kind of show the effects, at least not in those industries in which we don't have a natural experiment like entry events. The second thing on the efficiencies is just, to me, a complete misunderstanding of the courts, how actually these procedures work. I don't know, there have been some errors also of agencies in doing this, but there's kind of this rule of thumb in this. If you get like a 2% price increase, maybe up to 3, you're going to say, that looks a lot like 0. So you ask the question, does it look a lot like 0? Does it look a lot like 5? Or does it look a lot like 10? And in 5, you definitely have to do that. And 10, you have to do a lot, or you have to prohibit. That's kind of the rule of thumb. Also, all of the economic instruments are not more precise than that. Even if you do your wonderful merger simulation that tells you that the price effect is 4.831%. It actually isn't, right? It's around 5. Yeah, that's what we want as qualitative information. And so kind of plugging into that UPP some kind of efficiency thing that we usually think on average the normal not price effects creating mergers might have is completely silly, because we're building that into our analysis anyway. So if you're thinking about a price effect from 1 to 2, 3%, well, let's think about a 5% price increase. The cost reduction isn't always fully passed on. So you need at least a 5% efficiency effect to outdo that. That's enormous in terms of what we historically get on estimates on efficiency effects of mergers. With 2%, I'm still happy because we're mismeasuring and so on and so forth. That's going to wash out, right? But not with a 5% increase. So plug in your efficiencies that that you're happy with as a base, like say 2 or 3%, you still have a problem. You're just changing the intervention standard of what your net effect is. So that makes no sense whatsoever. And what's worse is now creating some kind of other type of efficiency that the agency somehow have to prove was not clear at all why and how that's different. I mean, from the language, I'm completely confused. I have no, I'm we've been doing mergers for decades, and I wouldn't be able to identify the difference between these two things from the court decision. That's utterly not helpful, but also doesn't address any problem that we have in the process as such. We may have problems in the standard of proof that we're assessing on efficiencies, right? Which we haven't converged to properly, right? But and we may, if we kind of want to make it harder to get through, also balance this to basically saying it has to be somewhat easier to prove your efficiencies, right? Especially if we go in the direction of sometimes reversing the burden of proof, then we need a much better efficiency assessment regime. But this kind of stuff doesn't help with that. And so I think here, for me, kind of from the economics and from the whole way of how we're thinking about how we distinguish between bad and good mergers, that's the by far worst part of the whole decision.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, what you didn't quite say there is that, presumably there's a debate about why there's even an S in SIEC. And presumably the S is because actually you're kind of assuming
yes,
that you don't want to be stopping every merger that seems to have any tiny price effect because there are efficiency benefits. So by putting that S in, we're essentially allowing for a general merger efficiency benefit, one could argue. Okay, we should go on to the final part very quickly.
Yeah, I think I will really try to be very quick on this. So the final point here is the role of ex post analyses and especially merger retrospective in commission's decision making. And there has been a lot of studies on the impact of mobile consolidation on price and non-price factors, so especially investment. And the picture is quite mixed if you look at the studies. And the European Commission, I think Kai-Uwe might also want to say something on this, was actually quite in favor of this development of having a more thorough ex post analysis of these mergers. And I think this has also prompted some learning process on the part of the Commission with respect to the the design of remedies or commitments. However, in this case, the parties actually relied on some of those merger ex post studies in the telecoms sector and argued they show that those mergers are actually pro-competitive. And the Commission argued, no, these ex post studies do not necessarily have a very strong probative value, and they cannot replace the specific assessment of each and every merger. And it also was very conservative in the interpretation of the results. By contrast, the court, if you look at this paragraph here, seems to attribute quite a lot of weight in terms of evidence to one of those ex post studies, namely Geniakos and others, and argues that this ex post study shows 4 to 3 mergers have a positive impact on price increases, but also positive increase in investment. And on this basis, it also criticized the European Commission for not taking into account those the standard efficiencies in the UPP analysis. And the question here is, of course, so what is the relevant weight of those ex post studies? How should they inform merger decision making by the European Commission? And should they have any probative value or evidentiary weight in those cases? And I think I hand here over to Kai-Uwe.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually long argued when I was at the Commission that they should, against the resistance of legal service and others. The reason is because they are pushing our presumptions in one direction and another. And given that we don't have perfect evidence, that's actually good, because it's an evidence-based presumption instead of something that's a tradition-based presumption, which is what we usually use. Now, I think the difficulty here is whether the literature that you're pointing to actually supports the presumption or not. And I think that leads to some confusion here, because the quality of some of these exposed analyses, including what was submitted, at least from the description of it that one sees in the decision, weren't actually very good. We're kind of violating some principles on how you would actually do it. And you would actually have to weight what are studies that are actually meaningful, what are studies that are less meaningful. Some of that is being done, actually, if you look into the appendix, where obviously the chief economist team has written about this. And I find that appendix actually very informative in how to kind of weight these studies. But that has to be done. But it kind of leads to another point, and I think, Elias, you're going to be talking about this kind of in the summing up a bit as well, which is, how does the court assess something like this? It's certainly not the decisive evidence, but if we get evidence like this that basically says, look, in similar situations, which similar, the Austrian case with Hutchison and Orange, Austria, is a case that's not that different from what we've been seeing in the UK with a different kind of perspectives of those firms, et cetera, and the positioning of the firms in the market. So one should be able to learn something from that and use what one has learned about it. And so I think that then really requires going a bit deeper into that, and the question of how do we structure the court, or the way how evidence is brought in the court, that assessment can actually be done, which obviously at the moment the court wasn't able to effectively do. And that's, I think, something where we have to think about structurally. This is changing dramatically, I think, in courts where we have damages litigation now, because you're getting into more and more complicated things, because the world is complicated, and there's an enormous learning curve in the legal profession, and even among the judges, and who are also kind of learning and how to digest that type of evidence. We don't have the same type of pressure, because we don't have the same type of stakes that we have in these damages cases. But I think for a rigorous review, we actually need to have something there in that context of court review of merger cases as well.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that as well. We're not giving you a proper discussion, actually, I realise, because I think we're too much in the same place on this stuff. But anyway, which I hadn't anticipated necessarily, but anyway, we are. But that's good in terms of the fact that we're now at the summing up, because it means that hopefully we should be able to sum up fairly fast. Elias, do you want to go first?
So from a legal perspective, I think the way forward is very much already laid out by the European Commission, who appealed this case to the Court of Justice of the European Union. So I think a lot of legal scholars will now await, and practitioners will now await the judgment of the Court of Justice on this case. And the question is, does the court agree with the General Court, yes or not? If the court agrees with the General Court, it's very likely that at least some parts of the merger guidelines would need some revision. And one question is, will this case push the Commission towards a more rigorous assessment of qualitative and quantitative evidence, like, for instance, the Air Tours judgment did 25 years ago, or 20 years ago? And the question is also, might this have perhaps a perverse effect on the Commission, that it might run perhaps less complex theories of harm and rely on less complex evidence, just in order not to be subject to such a strict standard of proof? And one question, of course, also with respect to the ex post studies of these mergers is, will we, if the court attributes very let's say, partial reading to these studies? Will this lead to less challenges of 4 to 3 mergers, or will this economic ex post evidence at a certain point actually create some form of an economic presumption against 4 to 3 mergers? I think at this point I hand over to Kai-Uwe for the concluding remarks from an economics perspective.
I have not much more to say on this. I just think from our experience, also from UPS TNT, I think both in that case and in this case, the court had kind of the right intention to force more rigor in certain areas, but not kind of the right insight in order to do it in the right way. And the problem is that what that creates is an incentive to try to do less economics because it's going to be perceived as increasing risks in court review. So that gives support to those who've said, you know, you were always wrong that we were trying to do this. We should be going for dominance. And not kind of all of this other stuff. It will lead to a tendency also to use less data and more interpretation of internal documents that are often kind of interpreted in a way that's very hard to fathom, or actually interviews of firms that are done in a way that is often akin to a really badly conducted survey, for example. Those are areas in which there's given much more possibilities of interpretation. And I fear that's the direction things have been pushing in the first place. And it may give us much less rigor in actually looking at actual effects, what actually happens in the market. And I think that's both, as I said, it's bad in both directions. And so I fully agree with Elias there, but I think the enormous pressure towards reducing the risk in the decision making is going to lead to counteracting effects. I think what has supported in the past more economic analysis and kind of more precision have actually been decisions that have affirmed some of these analyses, like in Ryanair Aer Lingus, in which the court says, yes, this evidence is actually informative evidence to, together with other things, which is perfectly fine, but this is informative evidence to bring, and therefore kind of increase the security for the commission to actually use that type of evidence. And this type of case goes exactly in the opposite direction.
Thanks very much to both of you. It's interesting that it's been framed a little bit as a battle between the economics and the law. And I think it is a little bit that, although what's interesting is I don't think all economists think this is a bad decision. I think it would be interesting if there's anyone in the chat who is economists who think this is a great decision. It will be interesting to read that after today's session. More generally, I would like to thank Elias and Kai-Uwe very much for, I think it was a really good discussion. And to everybody watching, thank you very much for coming as well. And if there is any particular cases that you would like a CCP discussion on going forward of a similar sort, then please do let us know. And otherwise, thank you very much and good night.
Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you.
This.